Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about hair particles. It's something that I've used more than you think. It's not just hair looking stuff, but also objects that I want to scatter on an object without using geometry nodes. But I still use hair particles. I'm not adept with geometry nodes, so we're gonna stick with hair particles for the moment. Okay, let's begin. How do I start a hair particle system? I can just add a mesh, whatever I want. I'm going to add a cylinder and let's just move it up. Let's also add a plane just as a floor so you can see things better. And we can go to filter over here, or the filter icon, toggle the selectable icon, and now we can toggle it off so we don't select it by mistake. We want to select the cylinder. And then we can go to the particle properties panel and we can just hit add particle system as we clicked on the cylinder. You can rename it. So let's say hair, and you can have multiple hair particles. So if I add another one, you can add multiple ones on the same object, but I'm saying that you can add multiple particle systems for different ones. So if I had another cylinder and I wanted to add a new particle system, you can choose in between the two that you have created. But this here is basically all of the particle systems for this specific object. And you can definitely rename this one as well. Now what you get in the beginning is just a normal particle system, and if you hit play, you can actually see it moving. That's a regular particle system, but I want a hair particle system, so I can just switch it to this particle type, and I immediately get hair, but I get hair that is really strange. And that is because it is very straight, and it also has a hair length of 4 meters. So that is extremely long, especially for an object that is much smaller than that. So the first thing that I do whenever I create a hair particle system is reduce this to 0.1, let's say. And you get just for like objects, it's just a bunch of lines, but it gets exciting as we go down through the settings. So if you look over here, the first thing that we are going to see is the number of particles. Right now we have 1,000 particles, and then the seed, which is the noise or the randomness seed, but it just changes the beginning point of randomizing the entire particle system. And then we have hair length, which we just changed. And then we have segments. So segments is how many points is on this line. So right now we have 5 points on this line. And we'll deal with that later when we have hair dynamic, or when we deal with the particle's children's shape, which is down here. So let's first look at the source. And now if you look at the emit from, you're going to see that it has faces. So this is looking at each face and it's emitting a bunch of particles from there. So it's not looking at the vertices, and it's jittered. So it's using randomness. I don't really use everything over here. I just test things and see if things work out. And then there's even distribution. The reason why we have even distribution is because if you put just random, you can see that there are a bunch of ones on the top over here. But if I use even distribution, it's kind of trying to figure out an average for each face. So now we don't have just a bunch right over here on the top face. We can actually have it more even. And then use modifier stack, which I jumped over just because we don't have anything in modifier stack. But let's say I have a subdivision surface and I put it right before the particle system. If I go over here, I still am talking about emit from faces, but for some of these like vertices, for instance, right now we're only emitting from vertices. So how many vertices does this have? If you don't have the information down here in Blender, you can just right click and turn on scene statistics. And you can see that you have about, or actually exactly 64 vertices on this object. If I just remove the subdivision, you can see that there are 1,000 on these vertices. We only have 64 and we're trying to distribute 1,000 points on these. But let's say I have this subdivision surface. I know because of this subdivision that I have more vertices, although I don't really see it. If I go over here and say use modifier stack, then we can see that we have more. And the more I add, we're going to have more of the hair particles because we have more vertices. So it's simply using the modifier stack, whatever you have changing in geometry because of the modifier stack, then it's affecting the particle system because we're using use modifier stack. So let's go from vertices to faces, and it's the same thing, but with faces you get a lot more variation on each face. And if I go down a little bit, you can actually see it. On each face there are multiple hairs. Let's remove this, and let's also shade smooth or auto smooth. And then there's also volume. So volume goes from inside of the shape itself or the mesh. And if I go down here, we'll skip hair dynamics for now. We're going to talk about it later because it's animation and I want to talk about the static parts first, then the animation. If I go to render and viewport display is displayed as rendered. So we can just go here and check the render settings. Let's skip these settings first, and then I will hide the emitter. So it's currently showing the emitter. If I hide it, okay, so that's only the end result. So I have to remove it from the viewport display. If I remove it, you can see that it's emitting from the volume of the shape, which is not necessarily what I want at the moment. So I'm going to go back to faces, and yeah, this is what I want at the moment. I'm going to show the emitter. Most of the time I'm showing the emitter. I don't really hide the emitter unless I'm using the normal particle system, the emitter, rather than the hair particles. But with hair particles, I like to keep the emitter. And of course, if I'm showing it in the viewport, I want to show it in the render, at least for this. And then render as has different ones for the normal particle system and these set of settings or these set of options for the hair particles. So for hair particles, you either say none, which I'm not sure why I would use this. Okay, as I was editing, I figured I should know why or when to use path as none. I've seen before a tutorial where you can create the particle system as a force field, and with that you wouldn't really need to show it or to render it, and so you can use none for that. Or if you're going to use the particle instance modifier, which helps you instance objects on paths of the hair particles, let's say, but that helps in deforming the objects rather than just putting it on the hair as is. So it's kind of like using the curve modifier but with multiple objects. But path is the default, and then you can go to object, which is what we're going to talk about after we finish the hair particle thing. And then collection is the same as object, but it's a collection of objects rather than just one. So it's picking from a collection and then randomizing it on the object. So we're going to keep this for last after we learn the hair dynamics part. And this path is rendered. So if you want to render it in the end, so if I hit render right now, this is what you're actually going to see. There are a lot of things that we need to talk about. If you look at the hair, it's really thick and it doesn't really look like hair. We're going to talk about this also in a moment. But let's go back to here. So this is what render as path looks like when it's in render view. Now the path part or the steps over here is how many steps do you want it to take in order to, let's say, curl a hair or animate it. So if I do animate this later, it's going to be really stiff because it only has 3 steps, or in render view, it's going to be like that. And then the strand steps over here is going to be 2. This is the part that confuses me. I don't know the difference between the steps for, of course, the viewport and the steps for the render view are the same, but I don't know the difference between those two and segments. Okay, so I can't find this anywhere, but I've noticed that segments work more with the animation. So the more segments you have, the more flowy your animation is. But the path step or strand steps is kind of like subdivision, and that helps with the hair shape. But I don't know how the path steps affect the animation. I keep segments at 5 or 4 the majority of the time, but I adjust the steps over here for the render view and sometimes for the viewport display if I want to see how things are going to be rendered, or I can just render a few test shots to see how the rendered hair is going to look like. And then we're going to talk about material for render and viewport display later. For these two, I don't really use any of them, so we're not going to talk about them. And then viewport display is exactly the same as render. You can either say path or rendered. If you choose rendered, then whatever is chosen over here, then it's going to be the same for the viewport display. And then the color is dependent on either the material, velocity, and acceleration. I never really used these with hair particles, but I do use them with emitter particles. So the moving circles that we started with in the beginning. Because if you color it with velocity, then it's showing the fastest particles as a certain color and then the slowest as another color. And I think it starts from blue for slowest and then goes up to red for the fastest. And the same goes for acceleration, and this helps in the animation. So when I created this video, I had to use velocity in order to see if my particles are moving way too fast at certain areas, because the faster they move, they're going to penetrate the faces of the glass that I want around it, so it doesn't just fly away from the screen. So I needed to see the velocity, the color of those by velocity in order to see if it's too fast or if the animation is too fast, and I had to adjust the velocity and the other settings for the dynamics. But for hair, I never really use it, and I don't know how it would show velocity when the hair is just going down. Maybe if there's a character moving, I'm not sure, but it's something that I definitely don't use. And then amount is going to change the percentage of the rendered amount, but for the viewport display. And then the fun part, children. So we only have 1,000 particles at the moment. I don't increase this to be 2003. I just use children. And if you use simple, it's not going to look good. I'm going to tell you this from now. I never use it, and I don't know when you would use simple because it's always like this. There are always stray particles. So interpolated is the way to go. And what it does is that it puts 10 children, well, that's the display amount for the viewport. It adds 10 children per parent. So this 1,000 multiplied by the 10 is going to be 10,000, meaning there are now 10,000 particles. And if we look at the render amount, which is what's going to be rendered in the end, and this is not going to show you the render, this is still viewport display, just so you know. The render is what is going to show when you actually render the image. It's going to be 100,000. And I usually go up to 300 for this and up to 30 for this so you can actually see it better. And we're starting to see something that resembles hair. Now, length is the length of the children per parent. And you can just go from 0, which is nothing, to 1. And it does affect the parent as well. So I don't know when we would want to change the length over here in percentage rather than just changing it here. The seed for the children as well is the same as the seed for the parents. And then the threshold, I never really use. Basically, if you want to get what I get, I don't really use any of these. Parting, I don't really use. I use clumping. So clumping basically moves the hair in clumps. So if you have a cactus, this would be the look, and the opposite would be clumping it from the outside inward. And I don't know when you would use that, but usually I try to just do a little bit of clumping if I want to accumulate parts of the hair together. And then the shape of it. So the shape is basically showing a percentage from the tip of the hair to the root, and it's changing the clumping based on the percentage you give it for the shape. So you can notice that if I change the shape, there's going to be a curve, or there's going to be a point that moves up and down based on the clumping value. And if I go higher, you can actually see that only half of the hair, or only a percentage of the hair, is being clumped and the rest is just flared out. So if you want to add a little bit of a curve, then that would be something you can change. This is when you want to add the steps. I can add it to the rendered view, but we're not going to see anything until we do it for the viewport display. So you can see that it's much smoother now because I added a strand steps. That's something that you can also do with clumping. I'm gonna bring them back to 0 so you can actually see what is happening with everything on its own, and then you can combine all of these. Let's move on from clumping to roughness. Now this is my most used one. What roughness does is gives a natural look to the hair. Now every hair strand is just way too straight, but for the things that I create, I need sometimes fluff. So for blankets and rugs and anything that I've created before, I needed something that was a little bit rough or furry. And so I just go to the random part and I just add a little bit of roughness. And it immediately makes it look more like hair or fur. And you can definitely change the size, and the size is going to show how much roughness is going to be affected by this randomness value. You can also roughen just the end point. So what this is doing is getting the end point to the tips and then moving them using a noise or randomness. And so that's why you're going to see that some of them are just getting longer and moving to another place. They're not actually getting longer, they're just stretching the last point or the tip of the hair to a different area based on your random factor. And then uniform, I didn't explain this well when I filmed the tutorial, but there are 3 ways of adding roughness to your hair. There is uniform, endpoint, and random. Uniform is random, but uniform is accumulating every hairs that are close to each other and giving it a similar roughness. So it is still random, but based on the location of the hair. And it all depends on what you want, but for me, all I want is just a little bit of randomness for each hair strand, and that's it. This is what I do the majority of the time. To anything I want to add just a little bit of hair to make it a little bit more realistic. However, if I want to create something curly, like in this project, for instance, where I created this blanket of fur or wool, and I had to add some curl to it because that's how it naturally looks. And so I just looked here and chose curl, which is my most used one. I never really use any of the other ones. It's just curl for me. And you're going to see that it went crazy. The first thing you need to do is reduce the amplitude, and you have to hit shift, reduce it just a little bit, and you can immediately start seeing the curl happening. Also, I need to reduce this just so you can actually see things happening. Okay, now if I increase the amplitude just a little bit, you start seeing it going around. But because there's not much hair, I need to add a little bit of step. Now it's much smoother. And if I add length to it, then it's going to help that as well. Now there's more space for the amplitude to work its magic. And then we can add frequency. So frequency is how many times you want to curl. I'll have to reduce the amount even more just so you can see it. Okay, you can see the curls going over here. If I go down back to frequency, I can do, let's say 5. Before it was just 2, and so it's curling and then stopping. But if I put it up to 4 or 5, then we can get a little bit more. And then amplitude is just going to make it bigger. Now I added more curls, or added more to the frequency, and so I need to add more to the strand steps. Be careful when you add strand steps to the viewport display, because sometimes you might forget that for the rendered path, it's not the same. And so you're going to see something really nice over here, but then with the rendered path, it's not as nice because you only chose 4 steps rather than 5. So you have to always adjust this to be the same as this or greater. And then flatness accumulates a bunch of hair together, making it a little bit more like strands of curls, which is what a curly hair naturally does. I have curly hair and it's never just one hair at a time. It's always just clumps of hair that curls around each other. So yeah, this is already looking really nice. But if I'm going to do it for my project, it's going to be 2, and I won't have any flatness to it. I like it to be more like fuzz because that's what I'm aiming here. And then I don't really use clumping. I'm not sure if this is the actual value. Okay. And I don't have a long hair. Sometimes if it's really far away from the camera, if it's not a detail, if it's not a lot of hair, just fuzz on, let's say, a blanket made of wool, then like in this project, for instance, then I don't even add curl. I just add some roughness, and that's it. And it really looks nice. Let's go back to 1,000. And you can see it looks more like fuzz anyway right now. Maybe 2.5. Yeah, that's pretty much what I do. And this is showing what part of the hair you want to curl. I can just go back to the default. I never really touch these values. Here, I just touch the amplitude and the frequency, nothing else. And next, we're gonna go to hair shape. I do use this a lot. The reason for that is because when it's in rendered view, the hair doesn't really look like hair. It's just way too big. And maybe I need to change the material for this just so we can actually see what is happening. Okay, now you can see the hair is not really looking like hair. It's way too thick. That's because the root over here is huge. So if I go down here to the hair shape, it's 1 meter for the diameter. So I just go with 0.1 and it's already looking like hair. Not really, but it's better than before. And then the diameter of the tip is just 0 because that's what hair does. It just goes thinner and thinner until the tips. And you can also go to 0.05 if you want, because the more hair you have, the better this is going to look. And let's actually render it just a little bit. Let's do 300 for rendered, and let's keep this at 10. And let's save this first. Okay. Now we're safe. Okay, as this renders, let's talk about render time before we talk about even animation. The reason why the majority of the time when I use hair particles, I don't render an animation is because it takes a long time to render on my computer, especially if I try to add children particles, because that makes it from 1,000 right into 100,000. And of course, the more hair you want and the better you want it to look, you're going to have to add a little bit more. Now, for something really simple like this, it's taking my computer about 4 minutes just to render it, just because of the hair particles. And you can't even see the hair particles that much, but it's giving that velvety fabric kind of look, kind of like a couch or a pillow that has a little bit of fuzz, and it adds a lot to the scene, but it renders really, really slow. I don't have the strongest computers, but if you do have a Windows with a great graphic card, then you're in luck because you won't need any hardware, but I do if I want to pursue this for long term. Macs are great. The new Mac is also great with the M2 chip, but I think that the best solution for Blender is to have a Windows computer. I know a lot of people say that they can work with a Mac. I'm working with a Mac and I can, and I'm producing a lot of artwork with no problems. But if you don't have hardware yet, then I wouldn't invest in a Mac because it's much better if you have a Windows and you're able to add to it later. So if there's a new graphic card that you want to add, you can just remove the old one and add the new one for a fraction of the price of a new computer. And that's what a lot of Windows users do. And so if you want to do Blender full time, then I would recommend you go with that option, just because it gives you a lot more room to adjust your computer rather than buying a whole new computer or going through certain channels in order to get your Mac to be better or to fit the new technology that they have. But as I said, even the M2 chip, the newer M2 chip, is not going to be as strong as some of the graphic cards out there for Windows. Like Nvidia and Intel, they have amazing graphic cards that can get you something like this in 2 seconds. I know some scenes that could take me about 10 minutes to render. For some artists, they do render it in 15 seconds, no problem. And also, if you're going to work with 3D, the majority of 3D software cater to Windows computer or graphic cards that work on Windows computer. Now you can see that there's a little bit of fur around this. What if we wanted it to be hair that actually flows? I've done something like this, but not on this account, on the previous account, and this is the example. This is just a ball of hair that moves, and there's probably some rotation. So for something like this, the hair is much longer and it's animated. But what I use in my workflow, it's usually this. But if I want to, let's say, animate the hair, then I would need it to be a little longer. So if I go with 0.3, and let's actually go back here so you can see it better. And then I turn on hair dynamics. And if I toggle it, you're going to find first thing the quality steps. This is the quality step of your animation. How many steps do you want to take per frame for the animation to be a better quality, basically? So if I have 5, it's going to be the default quality. This is what they think is going to work. But depending on your scene, depending on how much hair you have and how much wind you have or forces around it, then you're going to need to fix this. With cloth simulation, I usually have it at 20. And then collision is how it collides with the objects around it. And also the quality, the more you have, the slower your animation and the better quality. I usually have this at 7 or 10. It works perfectly then. And then the distance is how much space before it starts colliding. The smaller you have, the closer it's going to be to the object, but there is definitely more error there because it can go through the face of an object. I like to keep it as is if I don't have close-ups. Collision collection we don't have to go through. And then structure is how the hair is going to behave with a certain force. So the vertex mass, right now it's 0.3 kilograms. I cannot really tell you what is the perfect mass because I just leave it as the default. It's a lot of things that I don't really go into ever, but it just changes how the hair is moving. Like, for instance, curly hair is much softer and fluffier and lighter than straight hair that is thicker strands, and it goes down much faster and because it is denser and heavier. So yeah, that's basically what you need to look for when you're trying to create animations that are a little bit more realistic. But I don't really use hair dynamics unless I'm using it with objects. And then cache is basically just caching the animation. So if I bake the animation, then I cannot really change much to it. It's just there, so I can just move it to whatever frame I want and I can see the animation really faster because it's already baked. And sometimes it even freezes when you render and it doesn't really animate the hair if you don't bake it. So I would go with baking the animation before you render it for the hair particle system. And that's it. If we close the hair dynamic, it should close the rest, except for cache came on when the hair dynamics is toggled on. And if I hit space right now, we can actually see it falling down. And depending on your segments, I think this is where I get confused a little bit because I still don't know the difference between strand steps and segments, but I think segments do affect the animation. And you can actually see that it's more like hair. Even the parts over here, because they're just stiff, they look more like straight hair that doesn't want to fall down. So if I render it right now, even before it renders, it's really slow just because of the hair dynamics and the hair particle system just in general. But that's specific to my computer. It's definitely dependent on your computer. And again, the more segments you have and the more strand steps you have, the more children you have is going to slow down your render time. And it looks like hair. It's really fun to play around with hair particles. Okay, we don't have to render the entire thing, but as you can see, it's already 7 minutes to render this animation. So imagine having 250 frames for an animation. You can do the math there. Let's first do materials, not here in render. It's called material, so whatever I added over here is called material. So if I change the name of this, it should change the name of the material. You can definitely have the hair emitter different from the hair itself. If I go back here, you can see that now it's called hair emitter. And if I go back to the materials tab and I add another material, because this is where things get interesting, you can have a different color for the emitter than the hair particles itself. So I just add another material and I add a new one. So here you can just add a slot for the material and then you can add a material over here. And now let's say I want the color of the hair to be green and the emitter to be blue. So let's say just this is called hair. If I go back to the particle system and I go here, render it or render the material as hair instead of hair emitter. So now it knows to give this the original material, but for the hairs, give it the hair material. And if I go now to the render tab, we can actually see that the hair is green rather than blue. So it's not following the object anymore. And you can even, instead of a principal BSDF, you can use a hair BSDF. And you can just change the color for that to green. Now, this is going to give you more of a hair look than the original principal BSDF that we had before. Now let's increase the number so we can actually see the hair rather than rendering it, because it takes a long time to render. And voila, we have neon green hair on top of a blue skin. Let's go back to 10 and let's move on to putting objects rather than hair. The first thing that I'm going to do is just remove the hair dynamics. It's going to stick out. If we go back here, this is how it's going to look right now because there is no hair dynamics. And instead of saying render as path, we're going to render as object. And the first thing that you're going to notice changing is this part where it needs to instance an object. So let's actually get another object. Let's get a cone, make it smaller. I'm just going to make it a little bit more interesting so we can actually see its face. Okay, now we have something that we can put instead of a hair. Let's move it to the side. And now if we select this, we go to the particle system and we instance an object, just get the eyedropper and get the cone. And instantly we have a lot of them on here. Scale is right now at 5%, so you can definitely increase it. And then there's definitely scale randomness, so you can have some of them smaller than the other. If you put one, then you have full scale randomness. And the bigger you make some, you're going to find that some of them are much bigger than the other. So this area has much bigger ones than here. And then you can also change this from not using the object scale altogether. And so it's going to get it just to the scale of the hair particles themselves. But I like to keep it at object scale sometimes, and it depends on the object scale, of course. Let's bring this back here, just closer. Now, if I increase the size of this one, it's going to affect the size of those other ones. And then object rotation you can also use. Now, depending on the object rotation, you can actually adjust the rotation of these particles. So I'll go with 90 on the y-axis. This actually made it stick out the right way. And now if I use hair dynamics, it's going to move them based on the hair. So this is not actually accurate. That's why I wanted to also show you the object. Because let's say you want to create a bunch of flowers that moves with a bunch of grass. It's going to move as if it's hair, but with no segments whatsoever. So it doesn't really take into account the segments on the object itself. And therefore it moves the object with the hair as if it's just a stick that doesn't really have any geometry. So I only use this if I want to add air or wind to the scene and I want some of the flowers to sway a little bit, but it won't really do much to the flowers themselves. So you kind of have to animate the flowers on their own and then let them just sway with the hair. But if you want to just arrange a bunch of things on this, then you can definitely use the hair particle system and create an object and just use it like so. We can also scale it a little bit, but also note that there's no collision detection between the objects, so the particles are going to be on top of each other. If you use geometry nodes, you can at least adjust the math in order to remove any intersecting objects. And let's say you have multiple objects, or let's say I have a bunch of spheres. Let's make it smaller. And now we have two objects. We can click on these two objects, click M, new collection, and call it, let's say, particles. And now, rather than putting on just one object, we can go to render as, change it to collection, and instance the particles collection. You can already see the spheres right next to the other one. And you can also say, use the whole collection at once. So how it's laid out over here is going to use it over here. So let's say you want to create a flower with this. Let's shade this smooth. Let's move it closer to the other object. And now we have a collection of objects that I don't want to merge together, and so they're like so. Also note that these are moving out from the actual mesh just because the origin of the two mesh are not in the exact same place. That's absolutely wrong. If you want a collection as a whole, then what you need is to put that entire collection near the center. You don't need to change its origins unless you want the spheres to maybe not go into the faces and go out a little bit. Then you need to change the origin for that circle to be on the edge of it rather than in the center, because that only affects how it emits on the objects or on your emitter. But if you're using a whole collection like I used over here, then you need to put the entire thing near the center and then hide it. Put it either in a collection called hidden and then toggle it off, or you can just disable it on the render. And the last thing you can do with a collection is use count. So let's say you want a ratio of 1 cone to 2 spheres or 2 cones to 1 sphere, then you can definitely do that over here. So if I do, let's say 2 cones, and then it's going to be 1 sphere, so it's a ratio of 2 to 1. So there's more cones than there is spheres, and that way you make sure that your objects are not overriding other ones. Let's say if you want more grass than there are flowers, then you can definitely do that with use count. I've definitely used it before with, again, grass and flowers for the spring trackers. I'm definitely going to put them on the screen. So we talked about limitations with dynamics, and then when it comes to materials, you just have to add materials to this. So right now, if we don't have any materials, this is going to be all white just because that's the default. So if I go to the materials tab and I add a new material, and let's say I want this to be yellow, and if I want the spheres to be red, then I can add a new material, make it red, and yeah, we basically have a weird looking thing that I don't know what it is. Also, I'm not talking about materials in detail just because I do have a tutorial for that later on. And we're definitely going to talk about how you can make your materials more interesting than just adding different colors. So definitely follow me on Instagram or subscribe to me on YouTube if you want to get notified about the textures tutorial or any of the other tutorials that I make following my workflow in Blender. Okay, that's it for hair particles. It's a longer tutorial for sure because there's a lot to cover, but I hope you benefited from this, and let's go through the thumbnail. I had so much fun creating this, but the render time is killing me for every test. I think it's taking about 20 minutes at the moment with all of the hair particles. My scene is really heavy that I had to deactivate it all in the viewport just so I can work and rotate things nicely. Okay, let's go through the easiest ones first. And that is this object over here, or particles emitted as objects. What I did is used a collection of little mushrooms that are bent differently. So I have one that is deformed or bent at 45 degrees on the y-axis, and then I have another one on the x-axis at -31, just to have multiple curves. So when I put them on here, they're a little bit more varied, because if I just use one mushroom that is bent one way, then they're all going to be bent that same way. And for some reason, whenever I use the advanced option over here, which is going to add the rotation, this is why I didn't talk about this in the tutorial itself, just because it's not really as intuitive as I want it to be. I do have the orientation axis as the global Z axis, and then I randomize the rotation. But as it randomizes it, it's not around the Z axis, which is a little strange. So I don't know how the rotation works, and I don't know why phase and randomized phase or amount doesn't work, and I think it's related to animation rather than just having it static. But I just needed the look of a bunch of mushrooms on the top of a rock. And how I made it only visible on the top part of the rock is by going to weight paint, and I painted the top part, and then that created a vertex group, and I renamed it density because I want to use this vertex group as the density controller. So I just go back to object mode, and if I go to edit mode, which you can go to with tap, and I just select, I can see what parts are selected based on this weight paint. It's sometimes a little bit more than what you have selected, so you can definitely go to edit mode and just adjust it by selecting these parts, let's say, and then hitting remove, and that will remove that part from the vertex group. So I'm going to go back to object mode, and then if I go to the particles, if I go down to the vertex groups, I can now select my vertex group for density in the density part. And if I also add it to length, then it's going to affect the length on the edges, making only the middle parts longer, and then everything that is on the edge is going to be really, really small. That's why I'm not using it with objects, because I need them all to be big enough to see. Although you can definitely do that, and it's going to be a little bit more realistic maybe, because usually with fungi you do have small ones that are just coming out. And you can also switch this. So instead of, let's actually remove this, instead of having the vertex group that you selected, maybe you select just a part and then you can invert it here, saying that I only want it on the parts that are not necessarily in the vertex group. And the reason why one is here is because there is definitely a blue part over here. Now let's just go back to the original and let's talk about these clouds. It's a little sporadic just because I still don't have the ones on here because I am not showing the emitter, and I'll show you why in a second. Now for this one, it's, if I turn on the particle system, it's just a bunch of hairs, or technically it's a bunch of round cubes that I remeshed. So if I remove this as well, actually let's remove all of them. I have a bunch of round cubes arranged in a way that looks more like clouds, and then I remeshed them to retopologize basically the object and to make them into one mesh. And then I used the particle system. And of course, because I am using the modifier stack here, the remesh isn't applied to the object. I have to also use the modifier stack, because if I don't, it's not going to look good. And that's my clouds. It's just a bunch of hair. I learned how to do this from, or I started doing these clouds with hair from Southern Shoddy on YouTube, because he has a, if I go, let's go to modeling, just because I don't want to adjust my layout. If I go to the asset browser panel, this pack is made by Southern Shoddy on YouTube and Instagram as well. And one of the things that I've used multiple times are these clouds. Some of these are actually images and not necessarily, actually let's just, because some of these were not his. Okay, so some of these clouds are actually images, so they're just 2D, as you see over here. If you want to add them over here in the background, you don't really need to have a particle system. He just renders some parts of his scenes as 2D images because it's just in the background, and so it gives you the look without the extra render time, and that's one of his tricks for speeding up your render time. But there are also these clouds with particle systems using hair, because his style is very cartoony and tactile and crafty, which is really, really cool. That's why he has these clouds. But I think it works with my style as well, because I'm not very keen on just having realistic renders. I do like some cartoony renders as well. He also has some models, another particle fur, particle pom-pom over here. There are also particle sprinkles, which is basically what I have right here. It's just scattering a bunch of objects. Also, the confetti is doing the same thing. He also has fuzz. So all of these are already made for you to put on your objects. So let's say I select this and I want to add this particle or this furry particle system. I can just drag it onto here. And that's where I learned how to make these clouds. but mine are not necessarily clouds, and you're going to see in a second why, because they're kind of not the color of realistic clouds. Then I have this blanket over here. If I go to the render view, which I'm going to show you in a few seconds, this is a blanket, a wool knit blanket using the texture of knit. And then I added onto it fuzz, because with wool and knitting in general, you do have fuzz on your items that are made with wool. So that's why I added fuzz to this. It's not very visible. It's just the parts that are actually reflecting light that shows the fuzz. I also added a little bit of thickness with solidify after I did the cloth, just because I don't want it to affect how the cloth acts, but I need some thickness in order for the material to look good, because with the normals, let me show you, if something is red, then with a displacement, it's going to be the back side. The red parts are not going to show the right side for displacement. So it's not going to show the knitted material or the knitted texture correctly. And that's why I add solidify in order to make it blue from each side. But I need to put it after the cloth. Actually, I need to put it before the particle system, because I need it from both sides. I need the fuzz to be visible on both sides, because even with that, the normal is going to affect how your particle system is going to look. Now we have both sides as blue, and so it's going to look good for the particle system and for the textures. Let's remove this face orientation. And then next, let's go to this. This is also affected with the density vertex group. Over here, I have two vertex groups because I have one for density. And if I go to weight paint, I can see the one for density. And then I have another one that is a pin group. And you can see that, let's isolate it. You can see that it's pinned from the back. And with this one, the parts that have hair that are colored red, and the rest won't have any hair. And now if I go back to object mode, I go back to the particle system, and I go down, I can see that I've used it for density. You can also use it for length, which means that the further away from the red part is going to be shorter, and the longer parts are going to be on the red parts. And you can definitely switch that, but it won't look good if you just switch the length. If you switch the density, but remove the length, then you're going to see that the hair is going to be on every part that is blue rather than red. Let's just put it back. Also, if you look up here with the emission, it's grayed out. I cannot really change anything, and that's because I did a particle edit, a manual particle edit. I used the comb to just spike up the hair, comb it together a little bit. On the eyes, I put them down a little bit. And when you edit your particles with particle edit, you cannot increase the number of particles over here, but you can definitely increase the number of children, because this is happening per parent. And so even though you're combing these are the parents, this is just going to follow that. We go back to object mode and you can see the children. And then I just added a display amount of 10 for render, or actually the children as 10 for render as well as the display, just because I don't want much hair. I think the display amount was enough, and so I just fixed the render from 100 to 10. And let's go back to this. And then the final one, let's find it over here. So this is how the curve looks. And if I go to the modifiers tab, I do have a skin on the curve, or on a curve that I turned into a mesh. So this is how it's looking. Instead of just putting it on the vertices, it doesn't really look nice because I only get just spikes of single hairs, but I wanted to have a bunch of hair to comb it however I want it to look. And so I just added a skin modifier. What it does is just add some geometry to a line. So if you don't have faces and you just have vertices and edges, then skin helps you add faces. And I added smooth shading, even though I didn't really need to. And then I used the modifier stack as well over here. For one of these, I do have two particle systems, just because I wanted some variation in the hair. The first one uses the volume. So even though I do have faces, I didn't want them to emit from the outside. I just wanted them from the inner point. And if you don't have the skin modifier, or if you don't have faces, it doesn't really look at volume for some reason. So the first one is taking in is emitting from the volume, and the second one is just emitting from the vertices. That's the second particle system. They're both edited with the particle edit. That's why they have this part over here. If you delete edit, then it's deleting the particle edit that you did manually in the particle edit view, and the same for the other one. They're both using a lot of children. Let's see. The first one is using 300 and the second one is using 100. And then I have some parting. I said before I don't really use parting, but I did use it for this because I found that the hair is emitting from the same area when I want it to just part a little bit. So it's parting the roots along like a straight line on the curve. And let's turn both of them on. You see how this is very small and sporadic and then emitting from the vertices. And then this one is parted a little bit, and I combed them both just to make the upper parts over here and the bottom parts more like a feather rather than just emitting along the normal, which is just going over here and then going over here. So I just needed them to be with the curve going through the motion basically. And this is how they both look together. And now let's bring it back. And if I look at the render view, we're not going to be able to see them correctly just because, as I said before, this is not really showing the final render view. This is just showing the materials, some of the hair particles or how they're going to look realistically in the render part, but not the exact number of hair or the final displacement, just like here for the knitting. And the background also has a little bit of fur or fuzz because it is a fabric. And this looks more like cotton candy than clouds. I also have to change the color of the background to pink as well, just because it doesn't really look nice with the white in the background. Okay, this is how it's looking so far. I'll show you the final render. Actually, my first render. This is how it looks. It's kind of looking like alpaca hair. The original color should be like this, but because I'm using Hair BSDF, I think it creates a little bit of variation and it makes it look a little bit more natural. The same goes for these. And then the fuzz over here is not that visible, and also the displacement on this is not looking nice. You might be able to see the fuzz over here just a little bit in here, but now that I've fixed the displacement or the normals, you're gonna see more fuzz. But I mean, it's going to be on Instagram as a thumbnail that is not going to be zoomed into just because thumbnails for reels are never actually looked at. They're simply a placeholder for a video. And then we have the fuzz for the background. I made it 3 colors, so it looks more like the fabric has multiple colors rather than it being fuzz. This is what I said with the white background not looking great. And I don't remove the emitter because then the hair is not going to look good. It has a lot of gaps that I cannot necessarily fill without sacrificing render time. And this is the hair close up. And finally, the mushrooms, which I'm not a big fan of its color still. Maybe I'll just add a different color for the top and a different color for the bottom. We'll see. So far, this is what I have. It's not the final render. I just needed to test it out. And I already have a lot of problems, especially with the displacement for this one. Okay, that's pretty much all I needed to tell you about hair particles. And if you try it out, please tag me on Instagram so I can actually see them and comment on your posts. I really enjoy seeing projects of other people, especially if they created it using my tutorials. It brings me so much joy. Okay, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.